Shavua Tov. Whew. Just came out of Shabbos. Had a special Shabbos. It was a very special Shabbos, a unique Shabbos. There's never been a Shabbos like the one that we just had. And maybe they will keep being unique, each unprecedented in their own way. But certainly today's Shabbat was unprecedented around the world and for us. How are you? How are you doing, my holy brothers and sisters? It's just a crazy time. A crazy time. Just try to get this in a position. Got two cameras going here, one for YouTube and one for Facebook. They're quite different. Christo Cheney says a good week to you, Sal. A good week to you, Christo. A good week to all of you, my holy brothers and sisters. And somebody sent me a message that I just received from yesterday. Said maybe I'm talking too much about COVID-19 at the beginning of these shows. I mean, okay, this is a Daf Yomi class. That's what our journey is all about. With God's help, there'll be 2,711 of these shows over the next 7 years. And may we turn the corner on this crisis as soon as possible. But while we're in it, I think it is my role to speak a little bit about what's going on, what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and to call on this community to come together and to pray. This is a community of faith that's here. I mean, if you're learning with me, if you're not a person of faith already, I hope you'll become one, because certainly that's what underlies all teachings of the Talmud, of the Torah. Everything is a gift from God, and prayer is our opportunity to thank God, to beseech God for good things like health and healing, which the world needs right now. So there's just a few points that I want to make before we get into our Talmud study. One was that yesterday, just before Shabbat began, a video went around from Y.Y. Jacobson. If you've ever had a chance to hear Y.Y. Jacobson speak, I mean, he's marvelous, he's hilarious, he's brilliant. He's one of the most in-demand speakers in the Chabad speaker circuit. He's a Chabad rabbi, but he's just brilliant and hilarious, right? So he does a lot of gala dinner type keynote speeches. He's great to hear. But yesterday he was speaking from his backyard. I guess he lives in Muncie. And one thing that he mentioned is that, first of all, as Shabbat comes in, that we should all be outside and welcome the Sabbath bride. And other messages like that went around LA. So especially in the Jewish neighborhoods in Pico Robertson and here in Hancock Park, the messages flew around. We can't gather, we can't make a minyan, we can't pray together, but we can stand on our porches and we can sing and we can welcome the Sabbath bride. Before Shabbat began, I was out there blowing my shofar. I hope that that's something that spreads. If you own a shofar, then right before candle lighting, next Shabbos, yesterday we did it at 6:45 p.m. It's 3 minutes before candle lighting. I don't know if next week's 6:45, or just a nice round, fairly precise time, or if we'll go with 3 minutes before candle lighting in your area, whatever works. We should be hearing shofars. We should be hearing shofars, because they are a call. It's a call to Hashem. It's a call to the people. It's a wake-up call. And then sing. And my son and I were out on our front porch. We actually crossed the street and we were on the sidewalk in front of our neighbor. You've seen her on our show before. Her name is Gabriella Karen. She's a Holocaust survivor who's been telling her story around the world. An incredible story, how she was an 8-year-old girl, and she and 8 other Jews were hidden by a young non-Jewish lawyer. I mean, can you imagine this guy? He had like a little 1-bedroom apartment, just a regular guy, a lawyer in his town in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, whatever it was then. And he hid 8 Jews in his 1-bedroom apartment for almost a year. Miraculous story. So anyway, Gabby lives across the street from us, and we stood on the sidewalk and sang Yedid Nefesh, Yedid Nefesh, which welcomes the Sabbath. And then we actually did the whole Kabbalah Shabbos service on our front porch, my son and I singing. And, we actually don't have any Jewish neighbors who sing out on their porches too close to us. But I think in other blocks where there's more people, more of a critical mass, people could hear each other and we're singing together. And I hope we will do that. Y.Y. Jacobson also said in his little video that went around before Shabbos that this Shabbos, which you just went through, is Shabbos HaChodesh, meaning the last Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Nisan, the month of Nisan, begins this week. Is it Tuesday? Now I'm not sure. Somebody check it for me and let me know in the comments. But Rosh Chodesh, the first day of Nisan, is this week. And that means that we're entering the month of Passover, right? So we've had some special parshiot, some special Torah readings. We would have had them in synagogues these weeks leading up to Passover. And on Shabbos HaChodesh, I guess there's an old tradition that some people, before morning prayers, before Shachrit, the morning service of Shabbat, they'll read the whole book of Tehillim. And Y.Y. Jacobson, Rabbi Jacobson said, this is a great Shabbat to make a point of reading the entire book of Tehillim, of Psalms, the book of Psalms. And I'm sorry I didn't get the message to you. I got that message right before Shabbat began. But listen, right now, any day is a good day to read Psalms, and particularly to read the entire book of Psalms. It takes quite a while, depending on your reading speed. I mean, it can be anything from like 2 to probably 4 or 5 hours. It took me about, I spaced it out over the day. I think I was probably reading for about 3.5 hours. Sometimes you pause and think about things, maybe look up a commentary. Sometimes you just keep going. But to read the entire book of Psalms in one sitting, I think this is the third time I've done it. The other 2 times is when I was flying to Uman, Ukraine for Rosh Hashanah. Or maybe when I was flying to Israel. Maybe I've done it 4 times. I'm not sure. But I highly recommend that you read the whole book of Psalms in one day. And these days, people have time. We have time. And when you read the entire book of Psalms, when you go through that whole journey with King David, who wrote the Psalms, it's so moving. Such highs, such lows. It's so emotional. You know, it's not stiff at all. I mean, if you think of scripture as, yea, verily, though we do this and we do that, the Lord this, the Lord that, and it's sort of like highfalutin language and you don't really connect with it. Yeah, so forget that. If you read the whole book of Psalms in one sitting with a good modern translation, there's many. I was using this, the Koren Tehillim. It's just spectacular, beautiful translation from Koren Publishers in Jerusalem on every page. So it's laid out like this, the English on one side, the Hebrew on the other. And it's so emotional. David is so raw, the way he expresses himself. You know, he's not like some far off, king in the ivory tower that everything goes good for him and the lowly people are somewhere else and they can't identify with him. I mean, David is raw. He expresses himself. He says how terrible things are going for him. He feels betrayed. He feels forlorn. He feels lost. He feels ashamed. He feels terribly ashamed. Then he triumphs. He feels good. He celebrates. He jumps for joy. He dances before the Lord. I mean, David's emotions are just all over the place. And it's almost like you're exhausted when you finish reading the book of Psalms, but in such an uplifting way. I highly recommend you read the whole book of Psalms in one day. So something that stood out to me today is a lot of things stood out to me today, but the one I thought I would share with you is Psalm 20. It's not very long. I'm just going to read Psalm 20 to you because this is a psalm that our sages suggest we read, we recite, we pray, we bless in times of distress, like the world is in now. And when we came out of Shabbat and read the news that the cases have spiked in New York City, it's very frightening, very frightening. I mean, the math is against us in every way. The curves are still shooting up steeply. The number of new cases increasing exponentially every day. My friends, you've got to stay home. You've got to obey all the mandates that people are telling you. Stay home. Don't mix with other people. We've got to flatten that curve. because the hospitals, God forbid, are going to be overwhelmed and doctors are going to have to make terrible choices of who gets ventilators and who don't. We need to stop that. We need to slow the spread by behaving properly and staying inside. So, Psalm 20. For the chief musician, a psalm of David. May the Lord answer you in a time of distress. May the name of Jacob's God be a tower of strength to you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and graciously accept your sacrifices of burnt offerings. Selah. May he grant your heart's desire and fulfill your every plan. May we shout for joy over your victory. And in the name of our God, unfurl our banners. May the Lord grant your every request. Now, I know that the Lord will give victory to his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some boast of chariots, some of horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise up and stand firm. Lord, grant victory. May the King answer us on the day we call. And thank you, Janice Beanstalk. March 26th, Thursday is Rosh Chodesh. Thursday is Rosh Chodesh. So it begins Wednesday night. I'm going to see if we can get, I'm such a bad singer, but let's see if we can get Moshe Storch or some good singer on to live stream with us on Thursday morning for Rosh Chodesh. My friends, we should only hear good news. Do not be afraid to pour out your heart before the Lord, the way David did. He was the king, for goodness sake. He could have been dignified and stood on his dignity. But King David danced before the Lord, shouted before the Lord, prayed before the Lord, sang before the Lord, was ashamed before the Lord, dropped on his knees before the Lord. It's so emotional, and we should access those emotions. And at the end of this teaching that I'm going to share now from the Talmud, I'm going to come back just to a verse from Psalm 106, which is so beautiful and so appropriate and so what we need to hear now. I will come back to that. All right. We are holding on page 16 of Tractate Shabbos. We're still in chapter 1. We are expanding on the fourth Mishnah and these decrees that were passed in the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah during the late Second Temple period. A bunch of decrees where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the followers of Shammai and the followers of Hillel, were able to come together, work it out, and have one policy to share with the people. It's very important. And it would become even more important. It's almost like preparation for disaster. The Second Temple still stood when they were able to settle these differences. They didn't realize that within not that many years, the temple would fall. It would be a total disaster for the Jewish people, one that you would expect the Jewish people would not survive, right? When the temple fell, the center of the whole religion just was gone and gone for good until there's a miraculous restoration of the third temple, which hasn't happened yet. The Jewish people, the Jewish religion, the whole thing should have ended. But they were prepared for that disaster, and we had leadership that was able to take us into that period, and those are the sages whose words we're studying now. One of those decrees was about metal vessels. Metal vessels, and we're going to get to that in 1 second, what it means that a metal vessel remains impure even if it is broken and refashioned. We're going to get to that in 1 second, because the other question that came up, this is very interesting, was that there was a new technology. Okay? In the Torah, we're told how to deal, earthenware vessels, right, clay vessels, pots and ovens that are made out of clay, which was the majority of what people used in the ancient world. Right? Most people were not rich enough to have metal vessels. Most of the things, they drank from a clay vessel, a clay mug, a clay bowl. They took their soup and ate their food on clay plates. They baked their food in a clay oven. If they were a little wealthier, they had metal vessels. Okay, and metal has different properties in terms of contracting impurity, ritual impurity, Tumah, and different procedures for purifying the vessel again. A clay vessel that becomes impure, you can't purify it, right? And this was a big deal, because if your family eats their cooked food from a clay oven, right? And so a clay oven was sort of like a large clay vessel with a big hole in the front, right? And fire inside, almost like a pizza oven, a hole in the top for the heat to escape a little bit. Most of the heat stays inside, and you could just stick the bread in there, stick it to the side of the clay oven. If a creeping thing, like a snake or a scorpion or some kind of filthy creature, went into that oven, it was rendered impure, so then you couldn't use it anymore. At least not to cook foods that needed to be pure. And the only solution was to smash the clay oven and get a new one. That was a big problem. Metal vessels could be purified. We'll talk in a moment about how. But the question that came up was glass. Now, glass had existed in the world even prior to the Torah being given. It was a rare thing. A very rare thing. It's just here and there. Some cultures had it, some didn't. Even the ones that had it, it was more like glass beads. But over the period, particularly the Second Temple period and Rome and the Roman Empire, the technology of making glass vessels became much more common. And people had glasses and glass bowls and glass plates. And the Torah didn't speak about what you do with glass. Can it contract impurity? If it does contract impurity, ritual impurity, how do we purify the glass? And so the sages decreed that with regard to clay vessels, and this is what we learn in today's daf, glass is similar to earthenware, to pottery, to clay vessels, in that it comes from the ground, right? Glass is made out of sand. When you heat sand, and do the processes that glass makers make, that is how you create glass. But of course, glass is very, you can almost say that clay vessels, you can sort of see what they come from, right? When you look at a clay pot, it's like, yeah, okay, that's not so dissimilar from clay in the ground. When you look at a piece of glass, it's very dissimilar from the sand that it came from. Nevertheless, it comes from sand. And so glass vessels are going to have some of the qualities that earthenware vessels have. So they can become impure from behind. So this is interesting. If you have a clay vessel and it's shaped, I don't know, I don't have such a thing, but it's almost like if you have a clay vessel that is sort of like this, right? Where let's say it's like that. And forget this little thing on the bell. But if this was just one vessel, right? So then it would have, and you can imagine, things that look like this, like candle holders, but it's more of a vessel. It's like a nice pot that you would put on the table in your dining room, right? Like a flower pot, a vase. It's like a vase, right? So there's an opening here, but there's also an opening here, right? So for a glass vessel or a clay vessel, if something impure goes in here, so then this is rendered impure as well. Different, however, if a creature goes into the airspace, doesn't even touch the sides, it goes into the airspace of a clay vessel, the clay vessel becomes impure. But a glass vessel does not. Glass vessel is not rendered impure by an impurity coming into contact just with the airspace. However, a metal vessel, so imagine this is like just a metal bowl, right? A metal vessel, if impurity comes into connection with its outside, so that renders the entire metal vessel impure, tameh, okay? But a clay vessel, which if it gets impure, you have to destroy it. There's no fixing it. A metal vessel can be fixed. We'll talk in a moment about that. But a metal vessel, if you touch it, an earthenware vessel, a pottery, clay vessel, if you touch the outside, the inside does not become impure. A metal vessel, if you touch the outside, the whole thing becomes impure. And glass has that same property. If an impure thing comes into contact with its outside, you're an undertaker. You walk through the room where there's a corpse being prepared for burial. By mistake, the glass that you're holding touches that corpse. The whole glass is now impure. Just like it would be for metal. But if you took a clay pot and it somehow brushed against the corpse, the outside would be impure, but the inside would not. You wouldn't want to take any risks. Whatever was inside that clay vessel, you want to get it out immediately. Get rid of that clay vessel, because corpse tumah is so intense, and you're not going to be able to get it off the outside. But what's inside is not ruined. That's the key there. Okay, so glass vessels become impure from behind, meaning from below, from another opening than the main opening, but not from the airspace like pottery. Metal becomes impure from a touch on the outside, as I just described, the touch on the outside, and so does glass. Glass has that same property. But glass does not retain impurity. And here we're going to talk about this thing that the sages decreed, that metal retains its impurity. So, if you have a metal vessel that becomes impure can be purified. Now, depending on the degree of impurity that it received, a corpse is different than a creeping thing, or just like a person who was impure then touched the metal vessel. The corpse impurity is much higher, right? But so if it's a case of sort of standard impurity, a creeping thing, or like a person who was impure touched the metal vessel, it can be purified. And there's two ways that it could be purified. One is that you immerse it in a ritual bath in a mikvah, which at least 40 sa of water, living water that's flowing, it gets immersed, and then you would wait until nightfall, and then it would be pure. But if it's corpse tumah, then it's like the same as a human has to be pure. And I'm not sure if I've got that exactly right, that if it's just a standard standard impurity for the metal vessel, just immersion and wait for nightfall. There may be a little more to it than that. I'm not sure at this moment. But for sure, with corpse tumah, if that comes into contact with the metal vessel, it needs to be purified in the same way that a human would need to be purified from corpse tumah. And that includes the waters, a sprinkling of the waters of purification on the 3rd and 7th day. The water of purification was water, a body of water is drawn from a spring, put in a vessel, and then a few ashes from the red heifer are mixed into it. A red heifer is the rarest of all cows that have ever been in the history of mankind. There have only been 9 red heifers that we know about, and they existed in ancient Israel. They came along, every few generations. It was like a perfectly red cow with not one, millimeter of its skin was not that kind of like dark rust color that cows have. A perfectly red heifer. Very rare. Only 9 happened right over the 1,200 years of ancient Israel. And then when they would find it, they go through a very special procedure. Eventually that cow was sacrificed. It was in a very special way. It was burned, and its ashes were collected. And then those ashes would have to be mixed with this very pure water to create the water of sprinkling. Interesting that these are waters, that only these waters can purify people from certain kinds of impurity, but the person who carries the water of sprinkling becomes impure from it. That's for another day. But anyway, a metal vessel that contracts corpse tumah would have to receive that sprinkling. Now that was very difficult to do. Like you can imagine, water for sprinkling is not available everywhere. Very rare thing. Maybe you had to go to Jerusalem or the nearest big city to do it. You couldn't do it right away. It might be very difficult. Might not be even possible at all. So people would resort to a different way of purifying their metal vessel, and that was to break it. They would break the vessel. Okay, and breaking it doesn't mean that you just throw it in a trash compactor and it just totally gets mangled and then you recast the whole metal thing. They could actually make a hole in the metal vessel that was large enough so that the metal vessel couldn't be used, and then they would repair it with lead, right? So they were using lead for their eating utensils, not so great, but that's what they did. And so people would rather break the metal utensil, repair it with lead, and then have a new vessel than to have to go through the trouble of getting that water of sprinkling and sprinkle it on the third day and the seventh day of its impurity, and then immerse it in the mikveh and wait for nightfall, right? And so because people didn't want to do that, and rather they thought they could just take this end route and destroy the vessel and form it again. And then what would happen was when they would do that, so then like a new vessel, they would immerse it, and they would think that it's the purification of that, that water in the new vessel, that was all they needed to do, and then they wouldn't even have to wait for nightfall. But they did have to wait for nightfall, and so the sages said, okay, the people are they're creating loopholes, right? they're going to the loopholer Rebbe, and these loopholes are creating problems. And so they decreed, and it was Shimon ben Shetach who decreed, that metal vessels would retain their impurity even if they were broken and formed again into new vessels. They would retain their impurity, and so the people couldn't make that end run around having to get the water of sprinkling and go through the full 7-day purification process. However, glass vessels do not retain their impurity. Glass vessels can also be broken and recast. It's much more difficult. We don't do that anymore. When we break a glass, throw it in the trash. But it is possible, if you break a glass, to pick up the glass pieces. And if you had, if you happen to be a glass blower and you had a furnace, you could throw the broken pieces in the furnace and it would just melt and you could fashion a new piece of glass, right? And maybe the pieces of glass were valuable enough that people were recycling in that way. And so the sages did not decree that broken glass would retain its impurity when it was fashioned into a new vessel in the same way that metal vessels would retain their impurity. Even if you broke them and fashioned them into a new vessel, you'd have to go through that purification process. Now, the person who decreed that metal utensils would retain, and then it was agreed to in these 18 decrees in the attic of Hanani ben Hiskiah, but the one who originally made that decree was Shimon ben Shetach. We've encountered him before. We met him during our journey through the first tractate of the Talmud, Brachas, and Shimon ben Shetach was the Nasi. He was like the chief rabbi of Israel during a very dangerous time. It was the late period of the Hasmonean kings, and the king at that time was Alexander Yanai, and he succeeded his brother onto the throne. His wife, the queen, was named Shel Tzion Hamalka, Shel Tzion the Queen. She was actually first married to his brother. They didn't have kids, and so when the brother died and Alexander Yanai took the throne, he married his brother's sister. It was a levirate marriage, meaning that the first son of their union would be considered the son of the dead brother who didn't have kids. But anyway, Alexander Yanai, like his brother before him, were bad kings, evil kings, terrible kings, who subscribed to the Sadducee philosophy, which is that only the written Torah counts, and you don't have to listen to the rabbis and all their rulings of law and the Talmud, etc. Were they bad because they had a different religious philosophy? No, they were bad because what they wanted to do was they were corrupt, and by sort of ignoring the rabbinic leaders of the nation and saying, oh no, we only hold by the Sadducee philosophy, they could basically do whatever they wanted. And there were a few Sadducee leaders who would say to the king, yeah, whatever you want, you could do that. It's okay, you could do that. Just make sure you give us some nice contributions to our cause. And it was a very corrupt system, and they killed many sages of Israel, both the first brother and then Alexander Yanai. The queen did stand by her brother, and remember we had that scene back in Brachas where there was no one left who could make a blessing at a royal dinner. And the queen said, well, I know somebody who can do it, but you have to promise me that you won't hurt him. Because that king had killed so many of the sages of Israel. He said, I promise. And she brought in her brother, and he made this bracha, and the king honored his promise to the queen. The queen sort of hung on, right? She'd been married to 2 wicked kings. She was a good person. She did her best for the people and for the sages, and she outlived them both. She outlived Alexander Yanai, and after he died, she became Queen of England and the ruler of Israel for 9 years. And during those 9 years that she was the queen and her brother Shimon ben Shetach was the religious leader of the people, those 9 years are considered the happiest years in Israel of the Second Temple period. So let us learn from Shel Tzion HaMalka, Shel Tzion. And she's also sometimes called Shlomit or Shlomit Tzion. Queen Shlomit is another way to refer to her. And let's learn from her that you could just hang on during the tough times, hold by your principles, do good, take care of people who need taking care of, and we'll come out the other side. We'll come out the other side, and we can come out into a period of great joy, health, and even prosperity. I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are tuning in late, that and for those who are tuning in late, I mentioned that today I heeded the call from Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, and he said we should all do this. You know, and today was a good Shabbat to do it because of Shabbos HaHodesh. But I'm telling you, any day this week, any day during this COVID crisis, any day that times are so bizarre and awful like they are right now is a good day to read the entire book of Psalms. It takes some hours. It's a long read, but it's so uplifting, so emotional, so beautiful. And when I read the whole book of Psalms today, a few things stood out to me. I read Psalm 20 at the beginning of this show. I would go back and listen to it. Psalm 20 is spectacular. It's a way of blessing people during a time of distress. Something else that stood out to me was Psalm 106. Psalm 106 is quite a bit longer. I'm not going to read the whole psalm. And really what it sort of recaps the history of the Jewish people and all the terrible things that we went through. And how God kept showing up and saving us. And just asking us a very simple thing. You're the Jews. I've given you a law. It's a law for the Jews. Not everybody has to follow this law. But the Jews have to follow this law. And if you would just follow this law, you'd be more blessed than any people have ever been blessed. And the Jews, we've been so stiff-necked throughout our history, and just so many Jews refuse to obey these laws because they have better things to do, because they know better, because they're arrogant, whatever their reason. Or maybe they just don't know. So many Jews, they don't know. They don't know the law. That's the tragedy of the time that we live in. But God is ever patient, ever forgiving, has never let us be wiped out, saves us time and again. And God prays that the Jewish people will just act like mensches and follow the Jewish law. And the main thing that we have to do, the main thing that law is all about, is acknowledging God and crying out to God. And so at the end of Psalm 106, at the end of this recap of Jewish history, it says, so the Lord's anger blazed against his people. Right? So this was a time when the people were sinning. When they had been saved, they came back together, everything was okay, and then they went back into their bad behavior. So the Lord's anger blazed against his people, and he abhorred his heritage. He handed them over to the nations, and their foes, their enemies, ruled over them. Their enemies oppressed them. They were crushed under their rule. Time and again, God rescued them. But they were defiant in their schemes and were brought low by their gate. Yet, and this is the last verse of Psalm 106, yet he heeded their distress when he heard their cry. My friends, we need to cry out to God. We need to pray for help. Do we need it spelled out any clearer for us? This is not just some random event that has completely changed the world. It's never been like this, right? Everything is crazy. Everything is topsy-turvy. And it could be much worse. This plague that has completely upended our world could be worse. Let's get the message from this plague and not some other harsher plague. And there's this beautiful teaching about this verse that comes from... I'm sorry. And yet he heeded their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake, that was in the last verse, verse 45. For their sake, he remembered his covenant, and in his great loving kindness relented. He roused compassion for them in the heart of all their captors. Lord our God, save us. Gather us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from eternity to eternity. And let the people say, Amen, hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Right, and it's Rabbi Kashdan, right? So there was a Rabbi Kashdan who looks, and he says, one may legitimately ask for God's reason for such great forbearance. Why does God forgive the Jewish people over and over again if every time he saves us, we just turn our backs on him again after a while? Why? Why does God continue to redeem his people in spite of their tendency to sin and sin again? The answer lies in our verse 44. That's why I read as I thought for a moment it was the end of the psalm. The verse 44 is, yet he heeded their distress when he heard their cry. V'yarei batsar lahem b'shamoy es rinasam. Right? Rinasam. The answer lies in our verse 44, which reads in Rabbi Kashdan's translation, yet he heeded their distress when he heard their cry. The Hebrew word, which Rabbi Kashdan translates as cry, is rina, which in most instances means song, not cry. The rabbis of the Hasidic dynasty of Modzitz, who are known for the emphasis they place upon the use of joyous melodies in spiritual worship, insist that rina should be translated, even in this verse, as song. God heeds us when we sing in spite of our distress, when we preserve our sense of joy in his worship, even while we suffer. This, they insist, the Rebbes and their followers of the Modzitz dynasty, this, they insist, is why he has not abandoned us. He will not abandon a people who resist despair. God will not abandon a people who resist despair and remain joyously faithful no matter their situation. Our psalm teaches us that he has kept his covenant with us precisely because of the joyful quality of our commitment to him, a mode of worship which he especially cherishes, one which is the very essence of Jewish people, rina, song, right? So even in these tough times, we need to cry out to God, to thank him for our blessings, to beseech him for our health, to heal those who need to be healed, and to save those who have been exposed, and to save us from even getting exposed to this COVID-19. And while we're doing that, and while we're crying out, we also have to maintain joy. We also have to sing. We have to find it in our hearts to sing in our homes, to sing on our porches. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, when Shabbat came in, people were singing on their porches. Friday evening, next Friday, commit. You're going to stand on your porch and sing to welcome Shabbos. Anytime you can find the energy in yourself, sing. Cry out to God for help and sing for joy the blessings that we do have. This is the secret to Jewish survival, and this has got to be the secret to our whole world surviving. Of course, the doctors are going to do their job. The scientists are going to do their job. The soldiers are going to do their job. The leaders are going to do their job. And we are going to do our job. While we're confined to our homes, we can learn Torah together. That's a big merit, and we're doing that right here in our class. And we can sing together, and we can cry out together, and we can pray together, and we can do our part so that this plague of COVID-19 can pass speedily and completely, and we can be restored to health and a society that is healthy and an economy that is healthy and all good things. And let us say Amen. Whew. And one last thing. We will add to this list. If you want to add names of people who are sick and need a healing, please put their names in the comments or message us. Message us is even better. Please respect people's privacy. If you know their Hebrew name, use that. If you don't know their Hebrew name, first name and first initial of their last name. We pray, please God, send a healing to Yehudis bas Lenore, Babet bas Sarah, Rivka bas Yehudis, Golda bas Shandel, Chaim ben Rose, Chaya Esther bas Sarah, Devorah bas Sarah, Yosef Yitzhak ben Bracha, Charna bas Joan, Daniela bas Rina, Yorl ben Chaya, Yehudis bas Gittel, Hana bas Luba, Ilan Chaim ben Yael, Menachem Mendel ben Bracha Frida, Shoshana Varda bas Hadassah. And we say Amen. Ooh, there's a lot of comments I didn't see. And Caleb, Danielle, Ben, Sarah. Christo, is it Sarah? Let me know. Caleb, Danielle, Ben. You'll let me know if it's Sarah, what your mom's name is. And Janice Beanstock says amen, and we all say amen. I don't see any questions about our teaching today. All right. I will try not to spend so much of our... Yes, Sarah, thank you, Christo. I will try not to spend so much of our time talking about current events, and particularly the plague, that I think it's appropriate to... this too is Torah, and we must learn and we must address it. But also we're going to keep our journey through Daf Yomi going. So today we studied the impurity imparted on glass and metal vessels, how they differ from pottery and clay vessels, on Daf 16. With God's help, we'll continue tomorrow with Daf 17 of Tractate Shabbos. And I'm adding to our list, please God, for a healing, Shirachana bas Yehudis. Shirachana bas Yehudis. Okay, I'll come back and look at the comments and add names. My dear friends, sending you big love from the West Coast.